Hey photographers, welcome to the Bokeh Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm here to help you build a sustainable photography business. That means improving your photo skills, building on your business knowledge, and honing your marketing abilities. But it also means helping you work more efficiently so you don't get burnt out in the long run. We do try to bring the show to you commercial free, so make sure to check out our sponsors, photographersedit.com and Miilu, Miilu.com. Photographer's Edit is custom photo editing for the professional photographer, and Miilu is the simplest way to create and manage timelines and shot lists for the events you're photographing. Again, photographersedit.com and Miilu.com. All right, let's get into today's episode. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we're back for another Bokeh Podcast episode and brand new guest, and getting into a topic that we haven't honestly spent a whole lot of time on, and that is copywriting. I'm joined today by Kaitlin Senter. Kaitlin, thank you so much for making time to hang out with all of us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nathan. I was super excited when I pitched you and you responded with a yes. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, this is a really important conversation, important topic that honestly, I mean, over 400 episodes now, I think close to 440 episodes or so that I've recorded. We've maybe had 2 or 3 that we dealt with the topic specifically, the topic of copywriting, and more specifically, effective copywriting for the sake of converting a potential client. And this is something that we all, myself included, need help with. I know that photographers, emotional artist types can easily get wordy and not necessarily use the language, or for that matter, the brevity that we should to most effectively convert potential clients. We get excited talking about our craft and maybe about our personal lives or experience, or our favorite foods. I mean, you see that even a lot on photographers' websites, or certainly have over the last couple of years. But ultimately, our goal is to convert a potential client and of course, give them a really great experience. But we need to do the conversion part first, and copywriting plays such an important role in that, certainly can. And so we're going to get into that very topic today. You've got kind of what sounds like an interesting framework, specifically for the sake of copywriting, that we're going to delve into. But before we do that, we want to get to know you a little bit. And so the first question that I normally ask our guests has to do with brand position. Now, as a copywriter, I'm curious what your brand position is in your market.
Yeah, so for me, I just help small creative businesses put an end to the marketing guesswork and take their copy from, well, it's paying the bills, to breaking sales records. Because like you said, so often it's easy to get off track and to not really focus on even selling yourself. You may be able to talk about your work and what you love about your work, but when it comes down to actually converting and selling yourself, that's a lot harder. And sometimes marketing can feel a little bit like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that is not the point of copywriting. Copywriting is a science. So I help remove that guesswork. And we don't just want to cover bills. We want to actually have successful businesses.
I love that. Okay. But you talked about removing guesswork, minimizing confusion. What is that confusion for artist types in particular?
I think a lot of times it's just not knowing the exact right words to say that make people say yes. And as you mentioned that we're going to get into the framework a little bit, that's the framework that I use. And it's more about research. And once you figure out the best way to do research, you know the exact right words you need to say. So when your ideal customer lands on your page, they say, yes, that's me. And so it's a lot easier to get the yes and to make the sale.
Okay, that makes sense. And you also teased our conversation later on really well. So we're going to get to that in just a bit. Everybody stay listening in. Before we get there, though, talk to me about your experience as a business owner. What would you say is the most important principle personally that you've experienced, that you've seen really works for providing a wonderful customer experience?
So as a service-based business, which I know so many people listening are, I really think that it is just listening and listening well, and then pairing that with open and clear communication. So when you take the time to listen to what your customers are saying, you're able to communicate with them in a way that helps them stay satisfied. Because a lot of times when you're a service, you're doing work that's behind the scenes And it's kind of hard for your customer or your client to know what's going on and to follow what work you're really doing. So when you're able to listen really well and master the skill of listening, you can then communicate with them effectively, and that keeps them satisfied.
Okay, so these are really important points. And certainly right off the bat, I would agree with you, but I'm curious if you can give us a little bit of the nitty gritty. When we talk about, first of all, listening, this can be, I mean, it's, I guess first world problems. It can be challenging at times, right? Because for whatever reason, maybe we had a crazy day, we're distracted thinking about the things that happened in our day earlier. And now we have to have a conversation with a client or a potential client, and we need to be present. We need to be paying attention so we can then, as you pointed out, communicate more clearly. But do you have a tip, for example, for how to listen a bit more effectively so that we can then communicate more clearly?
I don't know if I have any concrete tips about listening more effectively than just...
You just do it naturally, huh?
Yeah, it's just important to me to make sure I'm paying attention.
Yeah.
I guess I can be very forgetful. So when I am having those conversations with clients, it's super important to me that I'm paying attention to the details, because if I don't pay attention to that and write it down right away, I'm going to flub up. So it's really more out of habit to protect myself, I think, than anything else.
Yeah, I've noticed that. It's funny, you talk about the significance of paying attention in the listening process. A lot of people talk about not having great memory, and yet, and myself included, by the way, and yet we're able to pull out the most random facts and information at the most random times, right? One of the things that I've learned over time, and I wish I could remember the original source of this, but it may have even been Tony Robbins. I talk about Tony Robbins a lot on the podcast, but emotionally compelling experiences tend to help make our memory or memories more concrete. And those that are not as compelling, especially with the amount of noise that we're naturally consuming in 2020, we just don't give enough significance to in order to then remember later on. How we're going to create an emotionally compelling experience having a conversation with a client really is probably going to be up to the individual and the particular circumstance. But I want to at least just throw that idea out there. I know that I have to make a concerted effort really to truly focus on what the person's saying in order to engage them well. At the very least, we should all be making that effort, because again, it can be easy to kind of go into autopilot mode and just, somebody's voice is droning on in the background and we're nodding and we're saying, but we're not actually there and paying attention. So I'm glad that you bring that up, because it's an important reminder. What about communication? And the thing that I keep coming back to this, just to give context, is too many times over in my life, I've made assumptions about what the person on the other side of the conversation, who I'm looking at, having a conversation with, how they process what I'm saying. I assume that if I communicate in a way that makes sense to me, then they should be able to understand it too. And that's just not reality. How have you learned to effectively communicate?
Kind of like you were saying, it's on a case-by-case basis. So when you're having a client meeting or that initial contact point, a lot of times you can kind of get a feel for how either hands-on or hands-off that person is going to be. And so for me, and for even, I know a lot of photographers, sometimes it's going to take scouting out a location, or it takes a lot of time editing or figuring out a style and all those different things. For me as a copywriter, there's a lot of research that happens before I ever put words on the page. So sometimes it could seem, depending on the project, like I haven't done anything for 2 weeks and you're wondering what your deposit is paying for. So I really work very hard to make my process pretty clear. And if that person seems like they are extremely hands-on, I'm sending weekly updates. I'm briefing them on my findings of the research, different sorts of things, just to make them feel really comfortable and understand that there are things going on behind the scenes. They just haven't seen the end result yet. But it really goes on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so we could sum that up with just the notion of management of expectations, like proactive management of expectations. That plays a really big role. What would you say, though? If you're sitting down with me and I'm a potential client, we're having coffee, and you're having conversation with me, is there a particular way that you have learned to more effectively communicate what it is that you're thinking, the service that you're offering, et cetera, more effectively to somebody so that they are able to understand it clearly? Is it just a matter of using the right words, or does that even vary depending on the person in front of you? I would say that varies on the person's understanding of what copywriting is. And a lot of times the obstacle that I come up against is that most people, and I'm not going to refute this, but most people would believe that they are good writers and they can write well. So they don't understand always what copywriting does and the whole need for it to begin with. So a lot of times we kind of start from there and we go from I kind of dive into what the whole purpose of the research is. And again, this is coming back to the framework that we're going to discuss later, is the whole purpose of the research and what that does and how it can help you make more and better sales, and why you as the business owner or whatever hat you wear in that company probably don't have time to do all the different things that I'm going to do for you to help you get where you need your business to go.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So, you continue to tease our later conversation very well. We'll get to that. Everybody stay put, keep listening. I want to get to my next question, which has to do with time. This podcast from the very beginning really was largely, and in fact, believe it or not, the Bokeh Podcast, we've been around for a while now, but even prior to the Bokeh Podcast, we had another podcast called the I Have a Life podcast. It was a reflection of another brand that I tried to develop. Didn't play out, but all this to say, the conversation, there's a theme through both these podcasts that is a focus on time management, more effective time management as business owners, because I don't think personally that I want to work for myself if it doesn't mean that I have more freedom and flexibility than the person having to do a 9-to-5 job or 9-to-8 job or whatever it might be. So time management, more efficient time management. I'm curious if there's something that you've learned about this concept as a business owner that's really helped you have that kind of freedom and flexibility and to be able to give time to the important relationships in your life.
Yeah. So like probably most business owners here, I'm constantly learning, but I have two things that kind of go hand in hand. And the first one is that I do batch my days. So that looks like taking time every Sunday to look over like all of my to-dos for the week and batching my tasks together. So for example, Mondays are my marketing days, Tuesdays I do client communication, etc. And I kind of throw everything into those buckets. But the other technique that I have is just a really liberal use of timers. So almost the entire time I've been a business owner, I've had my kids home with me, either part-time or full-time.
Sure.
So, and like so many people find themselves this year, I am actually going to be running my business and homeschooling my kids. And I don't just mean remote learning. Like I'm in charge of curriculum. We have fully withdrawn them and I am homeschooling them. So to make sure that everything kind of stays running smoothly, I like to kind of block my time into work hours, school hours, home management hours, etc. And I set a timer for to go off at the end of every block. And I treat the time kind of like I would treat it like the bell in high school. So whenever the bell rings, that class period is over and it's time to move on. And it helps me be a lot more efficient in my work too, because obviously when I'm schooling my kids, how that time goes, I'm not in control of as much because there's little people involved. But when I sit down to work or when I sit down to do things, for the house, it makes me a lot more efficient because I'm working towards kind of trying to game the system and beat the timer. And so I live and die by my timers.
So do you set these timers just like using the alarm on your phone, or do you have a special alarm that you've purchased? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I just use the alarm on my phone and I label them. And for most days, they kind of go the same. Like from 5 to 7, I'm usually doing some writing work. Then my kids get up and I try to finish some work here. And so they stay pretty much the same, my time blocks do, but I will adjust them and I always label them. So that way I never have to remember like, oh, what's supposed to happen next? Like the alarm tells me this is what happens next.
That's
and I
cool.
Just do that thing.
Yeah. Well, because and we've talked about this concept before, but it's easy to get drawn into a task at hand and then other tasks or responsibilities suffer as a result because we end up getting stuck there for a long time. It also means if we have kind of endless time to complete that particular task, we'll take the endless time to complete that particular task. Whereas if we create some structure for ourselves, it tends to make us work more efficiently, right?
Yes.
Huh. Well, that's
Yep. And I need someone to tell me what to do. And
yeah.
if that's my phone, then that's what it is.
No,
So,
that's
yeah.
smart though. I love that. And then batching your days or batching the work within your days, like or similar tasks. Is it a similar concept? Have you found that just kind of doing anything and everything every day was just not as efficient?
Yes, I would get sucked into, say I had to sit down to write a homepage for a client. Well, I would sit down and then I would be distracted by this email. And then I would be like, oh, I need to do this marketing task. And I would get 3 hours in and realize I haven't even started on the homepage yet because I kept getting distracted by all of these other things. So when I batch it that way is I know on Wednesdays, I only work on client work. And there's nothing else for me to do. And so it's a lot easier to stay on task when I handle it that way.
Now, outsourcing and delegation, this is a concept that we also talk quite a bit about. It's one of the most important elements of managing time more effectively. Is this something that you've experimented with in your business?
Just a little bit. And I know I'm speaking to, I guess, kind of a group of extremely creative people right now. So some people might be chuckling when I say this, but I really like to outsource design work.
Okay.
I feel like I know what looks good and what I like, but I just lack knowledge to kind of execute that.
Yes, sure.
And I will fall down a rabbit hole of working for hours on something only for it to never really look exactly the way I wanted it to.
Sure.
So if there is a template, a tool, a person even that can execute exactly what I need done, I'm going to give you all of my money. Otherwise, it's a one-man show around here. And I like to use my alarms and automations to keep me on track.
You're going to have a bunch of designers emailing you now. When you just made the statement about giving them all your money, they're going to be like, okay, sure, right here. We'll take care of you.
Yeah.
No, but I think you make a really good point, which is just because we enjoy something and maybe even halfway have an idea of how to do it, doesn't necessarily mean that's the thing we should be spending our time on. And there are effective ways, I've talked endlessly about this, but it bears repeating, which is that if we know exactly what it is that we're trying to accomplish on a bigger picture level, it makes it really easy, or certainly much easier, to filter out the things we shouldn't be spending our time on and then take those tasks and give them to somebody else who can also handle them for us so that we can focus on the things that will more quickly enable us to reach our goals. And it really is as simple as that. So I love that, even if it's just the design work, that you have found something you're able to delegate. And I think it's a great reminder for all of us that we need to continue to look for those opportunities. Talk to me, though, about an impactful business or maybe self-help book that you've read or listened to that's been just really impactful. This
one was hard. And, probably not for the reason that you would think. It's actually, I am more of a fiction gal, and I don't love reading business books. So mostly anytime I read a business book, it is directly related to copywriting.
Okay.
And so lately, this one was a super quick read. It's just called The Writer's Diet. And it's a little bit different. It's not about necessarily words that make sales, but it's just about kind of the flow of your words and how you can edit to make things just sound a lot prettier and nicer. And that's whether you're a novelist or a copywriter. It's really just more of the science behind kind of editing yourself and making things less boring and more fun to read. I really liked it. It's like a 75-page book. I loved reading that one.
Well, I think that length of book sounds great for everyone. If they're going to read something, you get through it pretty quickly. And tell me the name of it one more time.
The Writer's Diet.
The Writer's Diet. Okay. We'll have to put that in the show notes. Look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. And actually, for everybody listening in, if you go to bokehpodcast.com, you can see the show notes from the episode. You can also go to bokehbookshelf.com, and you can see the most popular book recommendations from our guests over the years. That's a really cool resource that Haley's also put together. So make sure that you actually take advantage of these things. But let's jump to the main topic at hand, really. I mean, as a copywriter, and I know this is a topic we could go various directions with and really spend hours and hours and hours talking about, but you specifically talked about a framework and are kind of leading up to our interview today called the Jobs to Be Done framework. Is this a concept that you designed or you learned somewhere else? What's the origin of it?
Yes, so I did not design this. It was actually an idea created by a Harvard professor named Clayton Christenson.
Okay.
But I learned it from one of my, mentors, Joanna Weeb. She owns copyhackers.com. If anyone is trying to DIY their own copy, or they aren't a copywriter and they're super interested in the science of it all, that is a great place to check out.
Copyhackers.com. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and that's where I learned about it, but it is not my idea. And a lot of times you'll run into kind of two different methods for this framework, but the best one, the one that's going to get you the most sales, is looking at the job that you do as a way for your client to progress in something. So it just means you're constantly asking yourself the question, how does what I do help my audience make the transformation into who they want to become? And we can get a little bit deeper in that in just a minute, but it's really just looking at how what you're doing is helping them become what they've always hoped to be.
And how does that tie to the phrase jobs to be done?
Mm-hmm. So it's looking past the job you're doing to the true job that they want completed, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you're a family photographer, well, sure, they want pictures of their family, but what do they really want? That's what you're getting to the heart of.
Interesting. Yeah. Because you're right. It goes beyond just a digital file or a physical print.
Right.
There's a feeling associated with that too, that you're wanting to create via an experience. That's interesting. Okay, so we understand the purpose of the framework then. Will you break down the components or maybe the questions that need to be asked that kind of lead us to this jobs to be done framework?
Yeah, so there are really four main questions that I will ask of a product or a service or offering to kind of get to the heart of the jobs to be done. And so I'll go deeper into each one, but the first question would be, what is the push? And so the push is the thing that is pushing them into finding a new solution to their problem or whatever the issue is. So they're thinking to themselves, what I have is not good enough. So the push is going to describe all of the struggles, the situations that kind of stir people up to look for change.
Okay.
Then you have to look at what is the pull. And the pull would be the fantasy that they create in their mind about how much better their life might be after they purchase whatever it is they're purchasing from you. So this is just how your job can help them make progress or get things done better, or help them become the person they've always wanted to be, or live the life they've always wanted to live, that kind of thing. And
before we get to the third and fourth one, the push, the pull, how would you differentiate these two? Because they sound relatively similar.
They do. So the push is really this is when they look around and they're like, if I don't get this solved. So again, we'll go ahead and look at photographers. The family is looking around at their walls and they're like, that picture was taken 10 years ago.
Yep.
And oh my gosh, if I spend one more day looking at this picture, I'm going to lose my mind, but I don't want a blank space on this wall. That's the push. That's going to be when they start thinking, I need to look for a family photographer.
Okay.
Right? But then the pull is when they start thinking about how much nicer their wall is going to look with an updated family picture, and all of the beautiful images they get to share on their Facebook feed, and all the awesome compliments they're going to get on their beautiful family. That's the fantasy they've created in their mind of how their life is going to be better.
Okay. So that's kind of like the feeling that I was mentioning just a second ago, like how they're going to feel as a result of this thing. So they're initially motivated by that push. And then the pull is like, it's kind of bringing them along further as they start to, as you say, fantasize about how they're going to feel as a result of having these new pictures. That makes sense. Okay. So that's the first and second. What's the third question?
So the third question would be probably the next thing that they come up against is, what is the anxiety? You need to examine what are these things that are stopping them from purchasing with you. Are they going to think that you're too expensive, or that their partner won't support it? you need to kind of examine what are they risking here and how can you ease that anxiety.
Okay.
So if they have anxiety in choice, you would define that as, do they not know how this thing works? Do they not know that things are going to be delivered on time? Or anxiety in use, which would be once they pay, what is holding them back from being a repeat customer? We have to kind of fight that anxiety by showing them how their lives can be better.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. I'm thinking, I'm taking notes as you're talking here, and I wrote down barriers, as in like barriers to entry. We have to minimize those barriers to entry as I guess entry into a new relationship, a client relationship with us. That makes sense. Okay. And then what's the fourth one?
And the fourth one is, what is the habit? So a habit would be something that either keeps them from switching to your method or to your service, or it's something, maybe you are a fitness trainer. And so how can you help them drop old habits to develop new ones? You need to find the places in their life that they're complacent and show them that what they have is not good enough if they are prone to convincing themselves that, you know what, it is good enough and I'm not going to go with this anyways. You need to find that habit and kind of niggle at it, I guess.
Yeah. That makes sense as well. I mean, I think about, so I can take my own company, Photographers Edit, for example, and I'm talking to photographers about the value of delegating their editing work to my company. And the habit, the so-called habit, for example, would be them doing their own editing. It's a comfort zone for them. I mean, you talked about design, doing your own design, how you enjoy that. A lot of photographers enjoy doing their own editing. They kind of hold on to that thing in some, if not many cases, because they feel like they can do it better. So I have to be able to effectively communicate to them why this is actually worth a change in habit in order to then delegate that work to us. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I love how practical and very simple these concepts are. How does this then translate specifically to the copy on the website?
Yeah. So right before we jump into that, I do want to, just for anyone who isn't clear, is an easy way to get answers to those questions that we kind of just talked about is to get them straight for your ideal customer. So that's going to either be through paid or audience surveys, or even just kind of sleuthing around and digging through Facebook comments or looking at reviews of similar jobs. Is just, it's important that you're not making up what you think would be the answer to this question.
Yeah, good old assumptions, right?
Right. You really need to make sure that you're getting as close to knowing what they want as you can. And the easiest way is to just ask them. But if you're new, a little sleuth style research on the internet, that works too.
I know. It's so funny. Like any relationship, personal, professional relationship, and I'm continually reminded of this, and it's something I have to continue to work on an ongoing basis. Really, the significance of not assuming, and even, well, I guess it really kind of goes along the same lines, not projecting. Right? There's so many times in my life and relationships and conversations where I assume something because it's my experience. I assume that somebody else has had a similar experience or is feeling a similar way. And while I think there's something to be said, certainly for experience, which then develops a certain knowledge base and understanding of our industry and the clients that we work with, it's still a smart idea, as you suggested, to have actual conversation with a client and ask them these questions and get it directly from them versus just assuming that we know what all of our clients would say.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to kind of accept that you're not actually your target audience, because it would be so much easier if you were, right?
Oh, that's so great. But yeah.
You got to remember that sometimes that's not true, is you are not the person you're selling to.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Wow. That in of itself is a massive reminder and lesson for us to take away from this conversation. So I'm glad that you highlight that. Well, talk to us then about how this translates to the copy on websites.
Absolutely. So this is the kind of information that you're going to use to write things like the hook or headline on your page. So like the most important line on your page, it's the very first thing that people are going to see. It's got the power to keep someone reading or have them click away. So you're going to want to use what you've learned from the Jobs to Be Done framework to make sure that that first line is resonating the most with your ideal client. You want it to resonate with them like on a really deep level so that they stay on the page. And so if they're comparing services and they click on your page, they know that they are in the exact right place and they're going to pursue what you do over the other pages they might have been looking at.
Okay. And when I'm like, I was actually starting to write down here when I'm thinking about, and again, I'm just being personal here, my company, Photographers Edit, if I'm thinking about how I effectively convert a potential client, and going back through this framework, what's the push, what's the pull, what's the anxiety, what's the habit, I need to address all these things. I'm a bit of a minimalist and a simplicity freak, so I kind of combine the push and pull and anxiety into one idea, which is the pain point. Does that make sense to do that, or is that too simplistic?
No, that makes a lot of sense to do that. And you can, there are several different ways to approach it. So, your hook line doesn't necessarily have to talk to a pain point.
Okay.
You could talk to their fantasy instead. So it could be like, have the gallery wall you've always dreamed of. That's probably bad, but you know what I'm getting at. So that's not really talking about a pain point. It's more talking about the end result. So really, you can use your jobs to be done to create a hook that either talks directly to their pain or directly to the fantasy that they have created in their mind.
The pull that you were talking about earlier. I guess maybe the push and the anxiety, the first and third points can maybe be combined into that so-called pain point. But then you don't want to leave them kind of focusing on just the pain. Then you want to talk about that fantasy, that really great feeling on the other side. So you address the pain point, but then you also highlight the feeling on the other side of utilizing your service or product. And then address, I don't know, I guess the habit also kind of almost falls into a pain point as well, but address the habit that is the norm for them so that they effectively feel like they can relax and give that or trust you, I guess, to purchase your service or purchase your product.
And if you want to circle this kind of back to the first question that you asked me, this is a great way to find your brand's position or your unique value proposition, whatever it is you want to call it. If you are struggling to find those things, you need to come to these questions and answer those first. And once you can boil the answers of all those questions down to one line, like that's your hook. You can just use different words to make it sound different. But as long as you know who you're talking to and what you're talking about, you've got it.
Now, I'm obviously all for, I mean, we talked about the significance of delegation. I'm all for our listeners hiring somebody like yourself who has experience as an expert in copywriting specifically. But if they had to write a line, for example, for their website, and maybe try to combine these concepts into a line. I mean, this is something I do something called brand position consultations we've published here on the podcast, where one of the things that I do is work with photographers to kind of narrow down and focus in the messaging. Ultimately, brevity it's everything, especially in this noisy environment that we live in 2020. So do you have a tip or a suggestion for our listeners as to how to simplify or ultimately kind of take words out, minimize the number of words that they're using in order to communicate these concepts to a potential client?
It really, I mean, it's like any creative process, and you just have to keep working at it. So a lot of times if I'm working on that for a client, it comes out really long and almost like a stream of consciousness. It's just a bunch of ideas jumbled together. And I keep working on that and pairing different phrases and words and things together until it kind of just comes down to a way that we can talk about that brand positioning in 5 seconds or less, and that anybody can understand. So you could say it to a 5-year-old, you could say it to your ideal client, you could say it to anyone, and most people are going to understand exactly what you do.
Yeah, and two things stood out to me when you were in what you just said. One was something you can say in 5 seconds or less. I'm like all on board with that idea. In fact, I would even say 3 seconds or less if at all possible, just because, again, I know people are bored so easily. Right. But then the other thing that you highlighted was that not only can an adult understand it, but a child can understand it. We're using words that are simple enough. And one of the things that I've highlighted on those brand position consultation podcasts is the importance of not simply using industry language, like words that we understand within our industry, assuming that our clients know what this thing means. We need to actually speak a language that they understand. So keep it simple and relevant.
Yes. So my kids are 5 and 6.
Yeah.
And so they know mommy helps people make more money with words. I tell them that all the time, and they understand. And I'll even hear them be like, "Oh, the copywriter's coming to visit," like when they're playing pretend. I'm like, great, wonderful. It just needs to be something that anyone can understand.
Oh my word. But I really love the summation of that. I mean, that should be your brand position. Just plaster that on the homepage of your website. I help you make money with words. That's really cool. I really love that. Well, this has been, I love speaking of brevity and simplicity and ease of understanding, you're a great communicator. This has been really practical information that was easy to consume, and I think really good food for thought for our listeners. How can they find out more about your services and follow what you're doing online?
Yeah, so you can find me at strikingconversation.com. Right now, the website is undergoing construction. We should have something new up on August 4th. And then I'm also on Instagram. You can find me at Kaitlin Senter, and I'm going to go ahead and spell that out. So Kate is K-A-I-T, and then Senter is S-E-N-T-E-R. I'm not really very active on Facebook or anything, so the website and Instagram are the two best places to find me. And there I blog. On Instagram, I try to do really quick videos under 5 minutes that explain like essential copy tips and all sorts of things over there.
Okay, cool. So we'll link to both of these in the show notes, bokehpodcast.com. And of course, for those who are going to go to the website, make sure you do go to the blog. I mean, I'm seeing like this first title stood out to me, 136 smart marketing words that help convert. Here's another one right here, 7 steps to a more effective content marketing strategy. So make sure that you take advantage of the resources there on the blog. Send Kaitlin a message if you've got questions or just want to thank her for sharing on the podcast today. Thanks so much for making time for all of us today, Kaitlin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, photographers, for listening to the Bokeh Podcast. Will you let us know what you thought of the show by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@bokehpodcast.com. We do try to bring this show to you commercial free, so make sure to check out our sponsors, photographersedit.com and Miilu, MIILU.com. Photographer's Edit is custom photo editing for the professional photographer, and Miilu is the simplest way to create and manage timelines and shot lists for the events you're photographing.